The great Alaskan wilderness doesn't just hide secrets, it buries them. Tonight, we're digging into 3 true Alaska horror stories inspired by real events, accounts from a pilot, a crew of miners, and an airman who discovered that the greatest danger isn't the cold. It's what's waiting for you in the silence. First, a pilot realizes the patch of empty sky he flies over every day is actually a hunting ground, and something is plucking planes from existence. Next, a team of miners unearths a fortune that carries a hidden poison, twisting their dream of wealth into a waking nightmare of paranoia and death. And finally, a young soldier looking for connection wakes up in a bathtub full of ice, the sole survivor of a terrifying plot he was never meant to understand. The most terrifying monster isn't the one that hunts in the dark. It's the one that smiles at you in the light, right before the darkness comes. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to be alone for what's coming for you next. The last thing Mark saw at the end of every shift was the back of his own bus, empty and quiet in the depot lot. He wasn't a pilot anymore. Now, he was a bus driver. His world was measured in the predictable rumble of the engine and the hiss of the hydraulic doors. He watched the same people get on and off at the same stops, his life laid out on a map with no blank spaces. It was safe. He'd traded the wild, endless sky for a route that had no surprises. But every now and then, a memory would flicker, a ghost in the corners of his mind. And he'd remember exactly why he drove a bus instead of a plane. It began innocently, the way most nightmares do. Back in 1982, Mark's life was his 2-seater plane. For 5 years, that cockpit was his office, and there wasn't a better one in the world. As a contract pilot, he was a glorified taxi service, running people and supplies between Anchorage and Juneau. In that time, he flew over 300 people, hauling everything from vital medicines to survey equipment. Navigating that wilderness was a skill. There was no GPS back then. You flew from one VOR station to the next, listening to the Morse code identifier in your headset, or using the ADF to get a bearing from a non-directional beacon on the ground. Mark was good at his job, a professional who trusted his instruments and his skill. Of course, he'd heard the stories. Every pilot in Alaska had. You'd be sitting in a hangar waiting for the weather to clear, or in a bar at the end of a long day, and someone would start talking about the Triangle. A place where planes had a habit of just vanishing. The victims weren't always daredevils or thrill-seekers. They were often everyday people, hikers, pilots, and even tourists, who simply disappeared without a trace. Mark would listen, nod, and nurse his beer. To him, it was just folklore, spooky stories to tell tourists. The Alaskan wilderness was a beautiful beast, but it was a beast all the same. Sudden weather, pilot error, mechanical failure. Those were the real killers, not some monster in the clouds. For years, that belief held true. The job was routine. But deep into his 5th year, things began to feel different. It started with the instruments. On a perfectly clear day, flying over a familiar mountain range he'd crossed 100 times before, the needle on his ADF, which should have been locked solid on the Juneau beacon, began to swing erratically. Then the VOR signal he was tracking dissolved into static. The Morse code identifier vanished from his headset, replaced by a thick, bubbling hiss, a sound so wet and strange it made the hair on his arms stand up. After that, total silence, a complete vacuum of sound. He flew by sight, unsettled, and after a few minutes, everything blinked back to life. He did a full diagnostic when he landed and found nothing wrong. A month later, in the same patch of sky, the air itself turned violent. He was thrown around by turbulence that wasn't on any weather report. It was a series of sharp, violent lurches, and a deep groaning sound came from the plane's metal frame that was different from normal stress. The plane was turned almost 90 degrees and dropped suddenly, as if a giant, unseen hand had grabbed it. He recovered, flew on, and blamed it on unpredictable mountain wind shear. He started hearing the dispatchers chatter differently. A casual mention of a lost plane wasn't just a distant tragedy anymore. It was a data point. The moment it all clicked into place came on a Tuesday afternoon. He landed in Juneau, rattled from another bout of the dead instruments, and the dispatcher mentioned that a small charter plane had been reported missing that morning. "Flew right past the spot you just came from," the man said, tapping a map. Then, poof, gone. Mark went home that night and pulled out his old logbooks. He started making a list, cross-referencing flights he'd made with people he knew for a fact had been on a plane that later went missing. At the end of 2 hours, he stared at a list of 20 names. 20 people out of the 300 he'd flown were gone. Then the final connection hit him, a horrifying, sickening realization. The spot on the map where all these people had vanished. It was the same exact coordinates where his instruments failed and the air tried to swat him from the sky. The stories weren't just stories. It was a pattern. A cold, sharp fear, unlike anything he'd ever known, took hold. He realized his own name was just one bad flight away from being on a list like this one. His time in the sky was over. He just had to survive long enough to make it official. He should have quit then, but he had one last contract. Mark's final flight into that place felt like a death sentence. The air was heavy and dead still. The moment he entered the zone, the radio went to perfect silence. The VOR signal vanished. The ADF needle spun uselessly. Then the shaking started, a slow, continuous shudder. The plane wasn't being shaken, it was being held. The engines strained, whining as they fought against something solid. The yoke vibrated in his hands, pushing back as if he were trying to steer through concrete. He looked out the window, and he saw it. A shimmering, invisible ripple in the air, bending the light of the mountains behind it, like warped glass. A deafening bass-level hum started, a sound he felt in his chest that seemed to absorb all other sound. This was it. This was the hunting ground. He shoved the controls forward with everything he had. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, with a violent shudder, he broke free. The hum vanished. The radio burst to life. He flew the rest of the way on pure adrenaline, landed the plane, walked out of the hangar, and never flew again. Now, from the safe driver's seat of his bus, he watches planes cross the sky. He still keeps in touch with a few of his old contacts at the base, a phone call every couple of months. In a drawer in his nightstand, he keeps a small private notepad. After each call, he adds the new names he hears about. He is no longer a pilot, but he has become a historian of the silence. In the 3 years since he's been driving this bus, he has added 27 more names to his list. He writes them down, one by one, the pilots, the tourists they were flying, the hikers they were dropping off. 27 everyday people who flew into that same invisible door and never flew out. He looks in his rearview mirror, sees the ordinary faces of his passengers, and he is grateful for every single one. His bus route is boring. That is why he is still alive. You hear stories out here, if you listen long enough. Stories about men who went looking for a fortune and found something else waiting for them in the quiet places of the world. This is one of those. It's not a ghost story, not really. It's something worse. It's a story about how thin the floor under your feet really is and how quickly a man's mind can fall right through it. It all kicked off in the summer of '69. Dale was the kind of man who saw the Alaskan wilderness not as a map of treasures, but as a business plan. He'd sunk every dime he had, and a lot he didn't, into leasing a forgotten gold mine up near Talkeetna. He put together a crew of 7 guys, a mix of hopeful kids like Randy and Kevin, and seasoned old-timers like Jerry and Larry who should have known better. For the first few weeks, there was a kind of magic to it. The air was clean and sharp, and the silence was broken only by the rhythmic scrape of their shovels and the groan of the old mine timbers. They were a team, carving a dream out of the earth. Then they found it, a collapsed tunnel deep in the mine, sealed off by a rock slide 50 years old. After a full day of clearing rock, a wave of cold, stale air washed over them, carrying a faint, coppery smell. In the beams of their headlamps, they saw it, a vein of gold ore as thick as a man's arm, glittering in the rock. It was a moment of pure triumph. Shouts and laughter echoed in the tight space. In a dark corner, half buried, they found a dozen old glass jars filled with a heavy silver liquid. Dale just said it was an old-timer's trick for processing and that he'd handle it himself. It was the first secret he kept. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard, monotonous work. Dale pushed them hard, and he was frugal, a fact that didn't sit well with Randy. He didn't see Dale at night, alone in his tent, poring over ledgers with a weak lantern, his face tight with the stress of the mountain of debt he was under. He just saw smaller rations and a boss who was hoarding the good stuff. The initial thrill of the work faded, replaced by the dull ache of exhaustion. The food started to taste bland, metallic. Sleep didn't come easy. The vast, beautiful wilderness that had felt like freedom now felt like a cage. They were about 2 months in when the routine was shattered. Jerry, one of the old-timers, didn't wake up one morning. Brian, the crew's medic, checked him over and called it a heart attack. In this place, at his age, it made a grim sort of sense. The pilot wasn't due to check in for another 6 days, so they wrapped Jerry's body in a tarp and carried him into a cold, dead-end tunnel in the mine. The sound of him dragging across the rock floor was the only sound for a long time. The very next day, they hit a pocket of gold so rich it felt like a sick joke. It was nearly $5,000 worth. As the crew stared at the glittering pile, Randy said what everyone was thinking. Damn shame Jerry had to miss this. The words hung in the air. With Jerry gone, his share got split 6 ways. Dale's cut just got a whole lot bigger. And just like that, the seed of suspicion was planted. A few days later, Larry was killed in the mine. A timber support, one Dale himself had checked, snapped and came down on him. It was a clean, brutal accident. But now no one believed in accidents. Randy openly accused Dale of rigging it, of killing them for their shares. The camp fractured. It was a prison now, and the men were terrified of the warden. The real sickness, which had been hiding under their exhaustion, now came roaring to the surface. Kevin, the go-lucky kid, started hearing a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He swore he saw Jerry and Larry standing in the shadows. A few nights later, he just snapped, screaming as he bolted from the cabin into the freezing darkness. They never saw him again. Dale himself was changing. A tremor had started in his hands, and his skin looked pale and blotchy. The crew saw it not as sickness, but as the physical sign of his guilt. The day before the pilot was due, Randy confronted Dale with a rifle, but in his rage and paranoia, he was clumsy. He stumbled backward over a woodpile, the rifle going off into the air as his head struck a rock. He was dead before he hit the ground. Now there were 2. Dale and Brian, alone in the silent, haunted camp. The next morning, the day the pilot was supposed to call, Dale went to wake Brian and found him on the floor, his body convulsing in a violent seizure. It was the same way the others had described Larry's final moments. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a murder. It was a sickness. In that moment, Dale understood. As he knelt beside Brian, he felt his own hands start to tremble violently, the blood pounding in his own ears. He stumbled to the radio, his body failing, and managed to scream into the microphone that everyone was dead or dying before he collapsed on the floor. The next thing he knew, he was staring at a white ceiling. The only sound was the quiet, steady beep of a machine beside him. A man in a doctor's coat stood by the bed, his face grim. He told Dale that a rescue team had found him and Brian in the cabin, both unconscious but alive. "What happened to us?" Dale's voice was a dry rasp. The doctor took a deep breath. "Your blood work came back. We found lethal levels of mercury in your systems. It was in the jars you found. Breathing in the vapors, absorbing it through your skin. It's a slow-acting poison. It causes tremors, paranoia, hallucinations, seizures. It drove you all mad before it killed your friends." Dale closed his eyes, the sterile white room feeling colder than any Alaskan night. The monster in the camp wasn't greed. It wasn't a murderer. It was the gold itself and the treasure it was hiding. He took a shaky breath, afraid to ask the next question. "Brian?" "He's down the hall," the doctor said gently. "He's weak, but his fever broke this morning. He's going to make it. You both are." Dale lay back against the pillow, the beeping of the machine filling the silence. They had survived, but the knowledge of what really happened was its own kind of poison, a truth they would have to carry for the rest of their lives. They were the only two to ever leave that mine, and the only two who had to live with the story of how 5 men died, chasing a dream that glittered like gold, but was laced with madness. The first thing Harrison felt was the cold. It was 2 a.m. on an Alaskan summer night, but this was not a normal chill. It was a deep internal cold that seemed to start in his marrow and spread outward, making his muscles ache and his teeth hurt. His mind was a mess, a thick fog of disorientation where thoughts couldn't form. His eyes fluttered open, struggling against a dim gray light. The sight that came into focus was jarring and wrong. He was in a bathtub. It was an old porcelain tub with a high back, the kind you see in forgotten farmhouses. The tub was filled with ice, and he was lying on top of it, the sharp edges digging into his back and legs. A paralyzing numbness had already claimed his hands and feet. When he tried to focus on them, all he could see was a blurred darkness where his body disappeared into the icy slush. A single, repetitive sound echoed in the small room. Drip, drip, drip. It came from a leaky faucet he couldn't see, each drop landing with a hollow plink that was unnaturally loud in the silence. It was a methodical, relentless sound, a terrible little clock ticking away in his nightmare. Harrison's brain, desperate for anything familiar, locked onto another sound from beyond the bathroom door. A low, steady drone. It was the dull vibration of an appliance, maybe a refrigerator, producing a sound that was now the sinister soundtrack to his terror. He tried to move, to sit up, but his limbs felt like lead, alien things that wouldn't obey his commands. He was a helpless observer, trapped inside a body that was no longer his to control. The story of how he got here began in a world of blistering heat. Harrison was 25 years old, a new airman in the United States Air Force, fresh out of technical training in Texas. His first duty station was Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. Having grown up in the sweltering humidity of Florida, he had never seen a real winter, never felt a cold that could steal the breath from your lungs. At first, it was an exciting new world, a stark and beautiful wilderness that was a universe away from everything he had ever known. But the first few months were crushingly lonely. He worked, ate in the dining hall, and slept in the dorms, surrounded by people but feeling completely isolated. He had some savings tucked away, and he used every dollar to buy a used truck. That vehicle was his ticket to freedom. On the weekends, he could finally leave the confines of the base, drive for hours under the vast Alaskan sky, and start to meet people. He fell in with a small group of people who seemed just as eager to escape the monotony of base life. They were friendly, adventurous, and for the first time in months, Harrison felt like he had found his place. One day, a man in the group suggested a trip. "We should all drive up to Talkeetna for the day," he said, and everyone agreed. The drive was long, winding through mountain passes and great valleys carved by ancient glaciers. The town of Talkeetna itself was charming, a classic offbeat Alaskan community that felt like it was from another time. But as the afternoon wore on, a small, subtle feeling of wrongness began to creep into the back of Harrison's mind. It was nothing he could put his finger on, just small details that felt off. A joke that wasn't quite funny, met with laughs that seemed a little too loud, a little too forced. A shared look between two of his new friends when they thought he wasn't watching. He dismissed it all. He was just tired from the drive. These people were his friends. They had welcomed him in. He had convinced himself that he had found a home in the great Alaskan wilderness. The last clear thing he remembered was sitting around a crackling campfire, the warmth on his face, laughing at a story. Then, nothing. His memory fractured and returned him to the present, to the agonizing cold of the tub and the relentless drone from the other room. He had to get out. He fought the numbness, slowly and painfully forcing his body to respond. With a surge of adrenaline, he finally pushed himself over the edge of the tub. He landed hard on the floor, the shock of the cold linoleum against his skin sending a jolt of pain through his system. The pain was good. It cut through the fog. That's when he smelled it. The air was thick with the sharp chemical smell of bleach, so strong it burned his nose. But underneath the bleach was something else, a faint, foul odor. The coppery smell of old blood mixed with the musty rot of a place that has been sealed away from the sun. He crawled out of the bathroom, his movements clumsy and slow. The floorboards beneath him creaked and groaned, the sounds impossibly loud in the dead silence of the house. He heard no voices, no footsteps, just the distant drone and his own ragged, panicked breathing. He made it to the front door, his numb fingers fumbling with the latch. The door swung open, revealing the crisp, cold air of the Alaskan summer night. He bolted. The sound of his bare feet slapping against the rocky ground was the only thing he heard as he sprinted away from the house. He didn't know where he was going. He just ran into the darkness, fueled by pure terror. He ran for what felt like an eternity, but it was only 10 minutes before he saw lights in the distance. A group of neighbors stood in a small clearing. They were not far, but they might as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. As he approached them, panting and desperate, he saw their faces twist from confusion into a mixture of shock and dawning recognition. The police were called, and Harrison told them everything. He remained stationed in Alaska for 3 more years, living with what happened that night. The local police did their part, but the investigation led nowhere. The house was a rental, and the people who signed the lease were ghosts. Harrison eventually told his military leadership about the incident. Their response was essentially, no harm, no foul. Since he was physically okay, he was simply told to be more careful and to never go back to that area again. He sought mental health counseling on his own and began the slow process of putting his life back together. But the world was no longer the safe, predictable place he had once known. He was left with an impossible contradiction. the cold, undeniable fact of his experience and the cold, unyielding silence of the evidence. The most terrifying monster isn't the one that hunts in the dark. It's the one who operates next door, in a quiet town full of friendly people, completely beyond your notice. Harrison never got his answers. The only thing he knows for sure is that he was a product that simply got away.